Welcome to Module 1, Introduction to Psychology. Psychology is the study of the science of mind and behavior. Prior to this study, it was viewed by biologists and neurologists that personhood involved only evolution, only chromosomes and genes programmed into our nervous system, which made determinations based upon our heritage. Over time, it became evident that psychology was also part of personhood, that a person's personality, identity, and purpose was a yearning for existentialism, a yearning for individualism, a yearning for identity. And our art started to depict this based upon Canova's sculpture depicting Eros and Psyche, in which it started to emerge over time that people were more than their biology. The biopsychosocial model of psychology emerged, and in the biopsychosocial model, we came to the conclusion that biology is valid from a medical perspective and a science perspective, but a person beyond the animal kingdom is also a psychological being influenced by their sociology and the circles of support that they receive during their lifespan. The science of psychology was founded by Wundt and James. Both of them are less notorious than their successors, as is always the case in early science. Wundt was a European psychologist, and James the first American psychologist. This leads us to the most notorious psychologist and theory one, which is Freudian psychoanalysis. Sigmund Freud was the founder of the theory of psychoanalysis, a method for treating mental illness based upon understanding the person's underlying identity, personhood, and purpose, which is somewhat less obvious than what they exhibit sociologically. Freud introduced a number of influential concepts. Those concepts were evolved over time, many discounted, because Freud was doing psychoanalysis of himself in order to understand himself under the premise that all of us were biological beings with likenesses passed on generationally. So as science evolved, we learned the truths that Freud gave us and what we now call notional ideas, which have less basis in truth. What we do know is that cognitive behavioral therapy, which Freud called psychoanalysis, is an understanding of a person's thoughts and emotions and behaviors, and how those thoughts, emotions, and behaviors influence one another. The idea of fixed thinking and growth mindset comes from an empirical truth of Freud. Freud believed that most of our consciousness is superficial, and that who we actually are from an identity perspective is unconscious. Unconscious because it is a matter of our biological development from our genetics and our chromosomes, but also our sociological influences from others, beginning with our primary caregiver. The id, the ego, and the superego is how Freud defined our underlying beingness, where the id is who I am. Deep down inside, who I am. The ego is who I exhibit based upon the influences that I'm expected to socialize or adapt to because of society's expectations, my sociology. The superego is that sociology. the influence of others, the influence of social groups, the learnings of what is acceptable in different environments. The problem is the delta between who I am and who I exhibit is where mental illness creeps in. If the expectation is that a person is expected to behave significantly different than who they are based upon the influences of the superego, that difference will result in stress and anxiety that can lead to disabilities from excess stress. Behavioralism is a science that superseded Freud. The idea of behavioralism is if a person can cope with the influences of the superego in effective adaptive ways through operant conditioning, much like a rat will, to the food being dispensed based upon the correct lighting up, that a person might adapt more effectively to the societal influences and be able to operate in the modern era in ways that are more in keeping with what is acceptable to others. Now, as we've already mentioned, that the weakness in behavioralism is there's only an extent in which a person can exhibit ego, which has a deep delta, a difference between their id without experiencing anxiety or stress or mental illness. Successive to Freud also were other theorists. Carl Jung, or Jung as some pronounce it, took Freud's view of the conscious and the unconscious to the next level of assessing personality based upon the influences of sociology. So a person's personality begins in childhood, and the neurological development that comes from the interoperability with the primary caregiver and those influences, and then expands to further circles until the person develops a balance between sensation and intuition, focused on the realities versus the possibilities, thinking and feeling, thinking objectively, logically, versus reacting to values, morals, consciousness in highly evolved ways. We all operate sensation and intuition on a continuum, thinking versus feeling on a continuum, and through a lens of either extroversion or introversion. Extroversion meaning bounce ideas off other people, collective thought, come to a conclusion based upon thinking through things in collaboration with others versus internalizing feelings, energy, and ideas. Our next theorist is Maslow. Maslow developed the hierarchy of needs. In the hierarchy of needs, Maslow depicts a scenario in which there is a prerequisite. We must suffice our physiological needs for food, water, shelter, and warmth before we can move to the next level, which is establishing relationships per Bowlby and Ainsworth's attachment theory, safety, security, and comfort. The goal is, through safety, security, and comfort, via attachment theory, that we leave childhood with secure attachments so that we can optimize our family, friendships, intimacy, and belonging to social ecological systems per Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory. Once sufficed, we have then access to the ability to create self-esteem, self-efficacy, role efficacy, team efficacy, per Bandura's self-efficacy theory, which allows us to set goals based upon the skills that we've developed to determine our future. We typically determine our future either based upon the influences of the superego or our own id, preferably if we understand our purpose, in order to seek self-actualization per Sartre's existential theory or Rand's objectivism. We will cover all these theories in this course so that we understand, much like in biology, the neurological system and how it interplays with the endocrine system and the other physiological systems, we will understand the systems of the theoretical depiction of needs. How does this all transpire? Piaget's theory of childhood development helps us understand how our various influences resonate based upon ages. So during our sensory motor stage, which is pre-birth, our neurological system begins to exponentially develop to 2 years or about 2 years. That's the sensor motor stage. Vast neurological development. The pre-operational stage at about age 2 to 7 prepares a person for the operational stage, in which some level of reasoning is possible. And then the formal operational stage, where autonomy, agency is classically a factor of adolescent development. What is psychology from the perspective of a practice? Well, classically, because of the work Freud did with psychoanalysis, psychology is looked at as a practice of therapeutic reaction to the environment in order to help a person existentialize. But we notice that independent practitioners, those that practice cognitive behavioral therapy, are only 6% of all psychologists, where 26% teach at universities, another 25% practice in hospitals or healthcare services, 16% work for the government, pretty much in the VA, treating military. Others work doing research in business and nonprofit, while other educational institutions and medical schools also employ psychologists in order to train their professionals. A psychologist is typically conferred a degree, a doctoral degree in psychology in the specific arena. For instance, my specific arena is childhood development and complex trauma. And through a ceremony, awarded a degree based upon typically a dissertation that was written in their specific narrow area of focus. Some clinical psychologists do not do research degrees and might get a side doctor to simply practice therapy and do assessments, and with no desire to teach or research. So that is our introduction to psychology. We will go, in the rest of the course, we will take each one of these theoretical constructs and cover them in deeper and relatable ways so that they're understood and how they play out for the individual and for society.